It was a little past 10 in the morning when Raymond Carter pulled his black Lincoln Continental into a rest area along I-94, some 40 miles west of Lansing, Michigan. The spring air was cool, the sky washed in pale sunlight, and the quiet hum of tires against asphalt still lingered in his ears as he eased into a parking spot. Dressed sharply in a slate gray suit and a light blue shirt, Raymond looked every bit the professional he was, a man heading toward a business meeting with a leather portfolio resting neatly on the passenger seat, containing documents for the governor's scheduled policy roundtable at noon. For more than 2 decades he had served as a district court judge, earning respect across the state for his calm demeanor, his unwavering fairness, and his ability to strip emotion from the law, while still honoring the dignity of those who appeared before him. None of that mattered when a state trooper's cruiser pulled up behind his car, red and blue lights flashing against the quiet backdrop of the rest area. Inside the cruiser, Officer Jeffers narrowed his eyes at the sight before him. A black man sitting alone in a polished luxury vehicle at a lonely stop. To Jeffers, suspicion was reason enough. Without hesitation, he radioed for his partner, Officer Reich, who was still minutes away, then stepped out of his cruiser without waiting for backup. Raymond saw the approach, lowered his window, and deliberately placed his hands on the steering wheel where they were visible. His voice was measured, polite, and calm when he greeted the officer with, "Good morning, officer. Is everything all right?" But Jeffers did not respond right away. He looked Raymond over, his gaze calculating and laced with suspicion, and finally said that they had received a report of a stolen vehicle that matched the description of Raymond's car leaving a nearby gas station. Raymond blinked, not in fear but confusion, replying that he was unaware of such a report, explaining he had simply stopped for a brief rest before heading into the city. He offered to show his registration to clear the matter, but Jeffers ignored the offer, stepping back with a hand now resting on the grip of his holstered weapon. His voice barked out the order to step out of the vehicle. The tone was clipped, no longer polite but filled with authority and presumption. Raymond's eyes narrowed slightly. He had no interest in creating trouble, but he also knew the side of the road was not the place to argue with a man who had already decided what he was looking at. He opened the door slowly, stepped out, and stood tall, his 6-foot frame calm and composed. By the time Officer Reich arrived, the situation had already escalated. Jeffers had positioned Raymond at the rear of the Lincoln with his hands raised, and Reich lingered nearby, her silence reflecting uncertainty, but no intervention. Raymond's voice cut through the air, still controlled but edged with firmness, as he asked to know what exactly he was being accused of, pointing out that he had done nothing wrong. Jeffers gave no answer. Instead, he circled to the driver's side, leaned into the open window without permission, and began rifling through the glove compartment. Raymond, keeping his composure, stepped forward just enough to make his position clear, and stated firmly that he did not consent to a search of his vehicle. That was all Jeffers needed to pounce. With a sharp retort, he declared it obstruction and interference with an investigation. Before Raymond could form a reply, Jeffers seized his arm, twisted it behind his back, and snapped a cuff around his wrist. Reich hesitated, but with a nod from Jeffers moved in to secure the other wrist. The steel bit into Raymond's skin, but he did not resist. His voice, steady and even, carried across the parking lot as he said, "You're making a serious mistake." A few travelers nearby had begun to notice. A college student on spring break had already raised her phone to record. A retired veteran sipping coffee muttered under his breath that the man didn't look like someone who had stolen anything, but Jeffers and Reich were too focused on marching their suspect to the cruiser, as if they had apprehended a dangerous criminal. Raymond walked with dignity, despite the cuffs biting into his wrists, his head high not with arrogance but with disbelief that years of service, honor, and professional excellence could be erased in an instant, reduced to nothing more than suspicion tied to his appearance. He sat quietly in the back of the police car, looking out the window at the blurred trees and the parking lot slipping away. He said nothing, but his mind worked, calculating, planning. He was not angry, not yet, but he understood something these officers did not. This story would not end the way they believed. At the state police precinct outside Jackson, Michigan, Raymond was seated in a hard plastic chair, his wrists now free though red marks remained. The booking officer had checked his ID, glanced briefly, and typed in the information as if it were just another routine entry. To them, Raymond was just another middle-aged black man detained under suspicion. His calm demeanor, his refusal to shout or argue made him even more suspicious in their eyes. Those who stayed quiet, they thought, were often hiding something. They mistook discipline for guilt. Jeffers passed by the holding area several times, each time glancing at Raymond with thin irritation, while Reich kept to the background, visibly uncomfortable but silent. 2 hours passed. Raymond had asked 3 separate times in respectful, clear tones to call his office, explaining that he had an important meeting in Lansing. Each request was brushed aside or ignored. Around him, the precinct buzzed with routine sounds, the low murmur of conversations, keyboards clattering, radios crackling. Officers passed through with occasional smirks at the well-dressed man sitting silently in the chair. His polished shoes, tailored slacks, and posture marked him as someone different, but to some that only made him a curiosity to mock. One officer muttered that he thought he was special. Raymond heard it but did not flinch. When Jeffers returned to lean against the wall of the holding area, arms crossed, he sneered and asked if Raymond was going to explain why he had been sitting there with his engine running. Was he casing the area, waiting for someone? Raymond looked up and answered calmly that he had simply been reviewing directions on his phone before driving to a meeting in Lansing. Jeffers scoffed, dismissing his words with, "You people always got a story." Reich shifted slightly, uncomfortable but unwilling to interject. Raymond recognized the tactic. They were waiting for him to snap, to raise his voice, to justify escalation. He refused. He had presided over too many cases where young men never had the chance to be heard because they gave in to the trap of reacting with anger. He would not fall into it himself. Time passed until Sergeant Pamela Yates entered, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She paused when she saw Raymond. Asking how long he had been held, she frowned when told nearly 2 hours for obstruction and a vehicle match. She approached him directly, asked if he had been advised of his rights. He nodded, replying that he had, but noted he had been denied any chance to contact his office despite multiple requests. Something in his calm, precise tone made her pause. She asked his name. He answered Raymond Carter, then added that someone ought to verify that name before the mistake grew larger. Jeffers, from behind, scoffed that he had been pretending to be important all day. Yates silenced him with a sharp look and turned back to the terminal to check. Raymond leaned back in his chair, silent again, waiting. He already knew what she would find, and he could feel the shift approaching. Sergeant Pamela Yates stood at the terminal, her eyes narrowing as the system loaded line after line of data, at first expecting to see nothing remarkable beyond a clean record or maybe an old traffic citation. But then her gaze sharpened as the credentials appeared on the screen. Academic honors, legal appointments, judicial certifications, and finally the unmistakable entry naming Raymond L. Carter as presiding judge of the 14th District Court of Michigan. She double-checked the photograph in the database against the calm man sitting in the holding chair, and her expression shifted from routine detachment to sudden realization. Turning back toward the holding area, she regarded Raymond differently, then stepped quickly across the floor, her boots tapping with urgency. Jeffers remained leaning against the wall, arms crossed, still smug, while Reich stood in the background, uneasy. Yates opened the door, entered, and asked with a new tone whether Raymond was the man scheduled to meet with the governor in Lansing. He confirmed with quiet composure that he was indeed Judge Raymond Carter, invited to a justice reform roundtable at noon. Yates's apology was immediate. Her posture changed, and she acknowledged that the incident should never have happened. Jeffers straightened, incredulous, blurting out, "Your Honor?" But Yates cut him off, laying out in icy precision the mistakes he had committed, arresting a sitting judge without probable cause, searching his vehicle without a warrant, denying him his right to contact legal counsel. She turned to Reich as well, pointing out her complicity in cuffing him without proper justification. The weight of her words pressed down on the room, and the silence thickened. Jeffers tried to form a defense, but nothing coherent came out, while Reich's pale face betrayed guilt. Yates returned her attention to Raymond, asking if he wished to contact the governor's office or be driven there immediately. He accepted, calmly thanking her, his voice not triumphant but weary, as though acknowledging that the damage was already done. As he walked out with Yates, the precinct buzz shifted. Officers who had earlier smirked now glanced up in embarrassment, the respect in their eyes forced by reality. This was no ordinary detainee. This was a man of stature, and they had mishandled him with reckless arrogance. but the consequences would not remain contained within the precinct walls. Already the young college student's recording of the arrest at the rest stop was circulating. The short clip showed Judge Carter, calm and restrained, being cuffed as he asked what he had done wrong. The student's voice off camera exclaimed in disbelief, "This is insane, he didn't do anything." The video raced across TikTok, quickly spreading to Twitter and Facebook, accompanied by captions like "arrested for being black in a suit." Within hours, hundreds of thousands had watched. By midnight, the view count exceeded 2 million. Screenshots of Raymond's judicial profile began appearing beside still frames of the handcuffing, amplifying outrage as people contrasted his professional standing with the rough treatment he endured. Hashtags like Judge Carter, Justice for Raymond, and Rest Stop Profiling trended nationwide. Civil rights groups, attorneys, and politicians voiced anger, some calling for the officer's suspension, others demanding systemic investigations into the department. The governor's office, after verifying that Judge Carter had indeed been scheduled for the roundtable, issued a terse statement, pledging commitment to equity and justice, acknowledging the seriousness of the matter. By late morning, protesters gathered outside the Jackson precinct, carrying signs that read, "Judged before justice and dignity in cuffs." Their chants were not deafening, but the symbolism was unmistakable. If a sitting judge could be profiled and humiliated, what chance did ordinary citizens have? For many watching, what struck deepest was not the arrest itself, but the silence of Judge Carter's demeanor as it unfolded. He had not shouted, had not fought back, had not pleaded. He had simply borne it with the solemn composure of a man who had seen this happen too many times before. That stillness, captured on video, became more powerful than anger ever could, sparking conversations about how deeply racial bias ran in law enforcement when even the highest figures of justice were not immune. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere had changed entirely. Jeffers was summoned to an emergency review session while Reich remained withdrawn, shaken by what she had participated in. Sergeant Yates now fielded a barrage of calls from Internal Affairs, the State Attorney General, and media outlets demanding clarity. Every officer knew the viral video had reached their computers. Many watched with grim expressions, some ashamed, some fearful of what the scandal would mean for the department. Younger recruits whispered among themselves, wondering if this could be the catalyst for real change. The system had often shielded itself from scrutiny, but this time the spotlight was unflinching. Meanwhile, at the state capitol, the next morning dawned with heavy anticipation. Outside room 312, where the Justice Reform Roundtable was scheduled, reporters clustered, cameras ready, and aides murmured updates into phones. Everyone waited for the man whose image had dominated every screen for the last 18 hours. At 10 sharp, the oak doors opened and Judge Carter entered. Wearing a crisp navy suit carrying the same leather portfolio, he exuded composure. The chatter ceased. Officials, legislators, and staff rose to their feet. Not out of protocol, but genuine respect. The governor leaned forward, welcoming him with the words, "We're honored to have you here," to which Raymond replied simply, "Thank you, Governor. I believe the timing speaks for itself." Before the scheduled agenda could begin, Raymond requested to address the room. He spoke evenly, recounting how he had been detained and cuffed by 2 state police officers without probable cause, based solely on suspicion tied to his appearance. He reminded them that the video circulating made the facts undeniable. But he emphasized this was not only about him. He was not the first and would not be the last if nothing changed. Trust between law enforcement and the community, he declared, could not exist without accountability. And dignity could not be optional. His words resonated deeply. Officials nodded. One assemblywoman brushed away tears, and the entire focus of the roundtable shifted. What had been planned as a technical policy discussion about training and hiring became a passionate debate about systemic reform. Civil rights leaders were called in, legal experts gave context, and video evidence was replayed on large screens. The urgency in the room grew palpable. Then came an unexpected development. An emergency review hearing was convened to address misconduct charges against officers Jeffers and Reich. To ensure impartiality, Judge Carter was appointed to oversee the session alongside other legal authorities. At first he hesitated, wary of appearing personally invested, but after the governor's counsel confirmed that no ethical conflict existed, he accepted. Within 2 hours, the lower chamber was filled with media, staff, and select members of the public. Jeffers entered stiffly, his complexion pale, jaw clenched. Reich kept her eyes down, avoiding contact with anyone. At the center sat Raymond, dignified yet resolute, flanked by fellow judges and the state attorney. He opened the session with clarity. The goal was not public embarrassment, but evaluation of conduct against legal standards and human decency. Evidence was presented: witness testimonies, body camera footage, timestamps, and the viral video itself. The body cam contradicted Jeffers's written report, showing he had ignored Raymond's calm compliance and manufactured claims of obstruction. When pressed, Reich admitted she had not verified Raymond's identification or run his name in the system, relying solely on Jeffers's lead. Jeffers attempted to argue he was following procedure, but his words wavered under scrutiny. Asked why he denied a phone call, he mumbled about departmental discretion, an answer that collapsed under the weight of legal precedent. Raymond remained steady, impartial, yet firm. His tone did not soften, his authority clear. He was not a victim here. He was a judge, ensuring that accountability could not be sidestepped. After hours of deliberation, the panel reached a unanimous conclusion. Both officers had acted negligently, violated protocol, and trampled the basic rights of the individual they detained. The ruling recommended suspension without pay, pending a full investigation by the Attorney General's office. Raymond read the decision aloud, his voice measured. The room fell silent. Jeffers' lips pressed tight, his gaze fixed on the table. Reich gave a small nod as though conceding what she already knew. Outside cameras recorded their exit. Protesters waiting all day did not cheer or jeer. Instead, they parted quietly, allowing the disgraced officers to pass in a silence more powerful than noise. Later that evening, at a press conference, the governor stood at a podium with Raymond beside him. He addressed the state, saying the day had not been about revenge but responsibility. He praised Judge Carter's restraint and professionalism, while acknowledging that such an ordeal should never have occurred. Then he announced sweeping initiatives: statewide mandatory training in de-escalation, racial bias recognition, and constitutional rights, along with the creation of an independent oversight committee to review future complaints against law enforcement. When asked to speak, Raymond stepped forward briefly, reminding everyone that what happened to him happened to people every day without cameras, without titles, without advocates. His case was visible because of who he was, but the underlying problem was larger, and it demanded sunlight, truth, and accountability to heal. His words reverberated far beyond the press room. Departments across Michigan began reviewing past arrests. Community organizations scheduled town halls. Legal clinics offered free consultations for those who felt unlawfully detained. Social media amplified his message, turning his calm stance into a symbol of principled resistance. The photograph of him in the Capitol, steady and dignified, became an emblem of reform. And within the police department, scrutiny turned inward. Jeffers and Reich's records were re-examined, and mistakes surfaced across years of service, exposing patterns of misconduct long ignored. Raymond, meanwhile, returned to his courtroom. He never invoked the incident while presiding, never altered his tone, never granted special favor. Yet those who entered sensed a difference. They approached with a deeper awareness that justice was not abstract but living, fragile, and worth protecting. The morning after the press conference, the rotunda of the Michigan State Capitol buzzed with anticipation and unease. The air thick with the energy of reporters clustered near the marble hallway, outside room 312, where the governor's Justice Reform Roundtable was scheduled to take place. Cameramen adjusted their tripods, journalists whispered hurriedly into phones, and aides hustled back and forth, their faces drawn with the knowledge that what had been planned as a technical discussion on policing standards had overnight transformed into a national event. At the center of that storm was one man, Judge Raymond Carter, whose name had dominated headlines, television chyrons, and social media feeds for nearly 2 days. At exactly 10 o'clock, the heavy oak doors opened, and he entered with quiet composure, wearing a dark blue suit pressed to perfection, the familiar leather portfolio in hand, his posture as dignified as it had been in the viral video of his arrest. The room fell silent, not because protocol required it, but because respect and curiosity compelled it. Some who had known him professionally for years looked with new eyes, reminded that beneath the reserved demeanor was a man of immense fortitude, while others, meeting him for the first time, simply stared in awe. The governor leaned forward as Carter took his place at the head of the table, greeting him with a solemn, "We're honored to have you here." Raymond responded with characteristic brevity, saying, "Thank you, Governor. I believe the timing speaks for itself." He requested to address the assembly before the planned agenda began, and when granted the floor, he spoke with a steady, deliberate cadence. He recounted how, on his way to this very meeting, he had been stopped, detained, and handcuffed by state police officers without probable cause, subjected not to lawful suspicion but to prejudice tied to his appearance. He did not embellish nor dramatize. He simply let the facts, now cemented by viral video, stand. His words carried weight beyond his personal story. "This is not about me," he said, his gaze moving across the table of officials. "For I am not the first, and I will not be the last if we fail to act. Trust between law enforcement and the community cannot exist without accountability, and dignity, especially the dignity of innocent people, cannot be optional." The room absorbed his words in silence, broken only by the soft sound of a young assemblywoman stifling tears. In that moment, the atmosphere shifted, the agenda transforming from technical debate to urgent moral reckoning. Video clips were replayed on screens. Legal scholars provided context, civil rights leaders were brought in to testify, and the planned roundtable quickly evolved into a tribunal of conscience. Then the unanticipated happened. Spurred by the governor's counsel and the palpable demand for immediate action, an emergency review session was convened to examine the misconduct of Officers Jeffers and Reich. And in an extraordinary turn, Judge Carter was appointed to preside as a neutral authority, alongside other members of the judiciary. At first he resisted, wary of appearing personally invested, but after confirmation that no ethical barrier existed and that his impartiality could be assured with additional panel members, he agreed. 2 hours later, the lower chamber of the Capitol, normally reserved for legislative subcommittees, was transformed into a formal hearing hall, its benches packed with media representatives, staffers, and a handful of community members who had managed to secure seats. The atmosphere was electric, the murmur of anticipation punctuated by the clicks of cameras and the low whir of broadcast equipment. The accused officers entered under escort, their usual confidence conspicuously absent. Jeffers, the more aggressive of the two, kept his jaw locked and his eyes fixed forward, his pallor betraying the strain. Reich avoided eye contact altogether, her gaze downcast as though trying to disappear into the floor. At the center of the chamber, Judge Carter sat flanked by 2 other judges and the state attorney, his presence commanding not through bluster, but through quiet authority. He opened the proceedings by declaring, "We are not here to relive public embarrassment. We are here to evaluate conduct and determine whether the actions taken violated both legal standards and human decency." The simplicity of his words set the tone for what followed. Evidence was presented methodically. The viral video, sworn witness statements from bystanders, time-stamped body camera footage, and written reports filed by the officers. The contrasts were stark. Body cam footage revealed that Jeffers had escalated unnecessarily, ignoring Raymond's clear compliance and manufacturing claims of obstruction where none existed. Witnesses corroborated that Raymond's demeanor had been calm and respectful, contradicting any justification for aggressive restraint. When pressed directly, Officer Reich admitted she had not reviewed his identification or run his name through the system, relying entirely on Jeffers's narrative. The panel asked her pointedly whether she now recognized that as a failure of duty, and her hesitant yes carried the weight of reluctant honesty. Jeffers attempted to argue that his actions were guided by protocol, claiming he suspected a stolen vehicle and followed training. But under cross-examination by the state attorney, his voice faltered. Why had he denied Carter the right to make a phone call? Why had he proceeded with the search without a warrant? Why had he treated the judge's refusal to consent to a search, an explicitly protected right, as obstruction? His answers stumbled, invoking vague notions of departmental discretion and officer safety that did not withstand scrutiny. Observers noted how his bravado had drained away, replaced by a twitch of the jaw and a tremor in his voice. Throughout it all, Raymond remained composed, never once lapsing into personal grievance. His questions were precise, his tone even, his authority undeniable. It was clear to all present that this was no longer about a single incident. It was about whether those entrusted with the power of the state could act without accountability. Hours passed as evidence was dissected and testimony weighed. Finally, as the day waned, the panel withdrew briefly to deliberate, then returned with a unanimous decision. Officers Jeffers and Reich were found to have acted negligently, to have violated procedure, and to have failed in their obligation to uphold the rights of the citizen they detained. The recommendation: suspension without pay pending a full investigation by the Attorney General's office. Raymond read the findings aloud, his voice steady, and when the final words left his lips, the chamber hung in silence. Jeffers sat rigid, lips pressed into a hard line, eyes locked on the table. Reich gave a small nod, as though conceding what she had long known. The officers were escorted out of the chamber under the watchful eyes of protesters who had waited all day outside. Yet the crowd did not erupt in cheers or jeers. Instead, a solemn silence prevailed, the kind of silence that falls when truth has been spoken too clearly to be denied. Later that evening, the governor stood before reporters, Judge Carter by his side, declaring that the day had not been about revenge but about responsibility. He commended Raymond's restraint and professionalism, saying they embodied the very qualities public servants should aspire to, but underscored that it should never have been necessary in the first place. Then he announced sweeping reforms: mandatory statewide training for law enforcement in de-escalation, racial bias recognition, and constitutional rights, as well as the creation of an independent oversight committee empowered to investigate future complaints. Questions flew from reporters, and at one point Carter himself was asked to comment. He stepped forward briefly, his expression calm, his voice unwavering, reminding everyone that what happened to him happens daily to countless others without cameras, without titles, without anyone to amplify their voices. His case had been visible only because of who he was, but the deeper wound, he said, required sunlight, truth, and accountability to heal. The word spread like wildfire across television broadcasts and social media feeds. Communities across the state began mobilizing. Local departments opened audits of past arrests. Community organizations held town halls, and legal aid clinics offered free counsel to those who felt they had been unlawfully detained. The image of Judge Carter standing at the Capitol podium, resolute and unbowed, became an emblem of integrity and reform. Inside law enforcement circles, scrutiny intensified. Internal Affairs launched reviews not only of Jeffers and Reich's conduct in the rest stop incident, but also of their entire caseload over the previous 3 years. Patterns emerged: disproportionate stops of minority drivers, questionable searches, inconsistent reports that painted a troubling picture of misconduct unchecked by oversight. Some officers defended them quietly, fearing the precedent of harsh accountability, but many more recognized the necessity of reform. For Raymond, life returned outwardly to routine. He resumed his duties on the bench, presiding over cases with the same discipline as before, never invoking the incident in his rulings, never showing favoritism, never letting bitterness seep into his courtroom. Yet those who appeared before him sensed a difference. The weight of his presence had grown, as though his courtroom now carried the authority not only of law but of lived experience. Lawyers, defendants, and officers alike understood that justice was not merely etched in stone above the courthouse entrance, but embodied in the man who sat on the bench. Every decision he rendered reminded them that the law must serve dignity, or it served nothing at all. In the days that followed the review session and the governor's press conference, the reverberations of Judge Raymond Carter's ordeal did not fade as quickly as so many news cycles often do. Instead, they deepened, spread, and reshaped the conversation across Michigan and beyond. The governor's announcement of mandatory statewide training on de-escalation, racial bias recognition, and constitutional rights training became headline news, debated on talk shows, dissected by legal scholars, and championed by activists who had been demanding reform for decades. The formation of an independent oversight committee to review complaints against law enforcement across all counties signaled a structural shift. A recognition that internal accountability was no longer sufficient, that the public demanded transparency and real consequences. At the same time, the faces of officers Jeffers and Reich became symbols of the opposite side of the story. The arrogance of unchecked authority, the dangers of bias and assumption, the cost of negligence when backed by a badge. Their suspension without pay triggered deeper investigations into not only the events at the rest stop, but also into their entire careers. Cases they had worked on were pulled back under scrutiny. Transcripts reread, body cam footage reviewed, and slowly patterns began to emerge that showed the rest. Stop incident was not an isolated lapse but part of a troubling continuum of misconduct. Defense attorneys filed motions challenging convictions. Citizens came forward with complaints they had once believed would never be heard, and the ripple widened into a reckoning. For the public, however, the image that endured was not of the disgraced officers but of the man who had been their target. Sitting silent in the back of the cruiser, head held high, later standing before cameras not with fury but with resolve. That stillness, that composure became emblematic of a deeper truth, that justice was strongest, not when shouted in anger but when insisted upon with clarity and calm. Raymond himself did not linger in the spotlight. After fulfilling his duties at the Capitol, he returned to his courtroom with no mention of what had happened to him, no indulgence in bitterness, no departure from his usual manner. He presided as he always had, letting the law guide him, but those who entered his courtroom now did so with a heightened awareness, sensing the gravity of his presence. Attorneys argued their cases more carefully, defendants watched more intently, and even police officers testifying on the stand carried themselves differently, knowing that the man who judged them had once been judged unjustly and would tolerate no corruption of fairness. 3 months later, on a bright spring afternoon, Judge Carter stood on the wide stone steps outside the Michigan Law Enforcement Training Academy, the trees nearby beginning to bloom, flags snapping in the breeze, and rows of new cadets arrayed in crisp uniforms before him. This was the first class to graduate under the reformed training standards, the very reforms born out of his experience, and the firestorm it had ignited. 52 recruits stood in formation, eyes forward, shoulders squared, a mixture of pride and gravity in their expressions. They had undergone extensive courses on community engagement, de-escalation strategies, and constitutional protections. What had once been considered controversial had now become the bedrock of modern policing, and though not everyone in law enforcement welcomed the change, the cadets standing before him understood that they were the first embodiment of a new standard. Raymond had declined most public appearances since the incident, preferring to let the reforms and policies speak for themselves. But he had accepted this invitation because it was not about cameras or headlines. It was about planting seeds in the hearts and minds of those about to wear the badge. As he stepped to the podium, the academy director nodded with respect, and Raymond adjusted the microphone, his voice carrying in the still air with the calm steadiness that had come to define him. He told the cadets that 3 months earlier he had stood on the other side of a badge, not as a judge, not even as a man, but as a threat based solely on a glance and a guess. That experience, he said, could have made him bitter, but instead it had made him more committed not to punishment but to purpose. He reminded them they were not simply enforcers of laws but guardians of dignity, and that dignity began with how they chose to see every person, not as a statistic, not as a risk, but as someone's father, mother, sister, or friend. His words sank into the silence, and though the cadets stood formally at attention, some nodded subtly, their expressions softening as the truth settled over them. For a moment, the formality of the ceremony gave way to something deeper, a recognition that they were inheriting not just authority, but responsibility. After the ceremony, as the cadets filed out toward their waiting families, one young black recruit paused, turned back, and said simply, "Thank you, sir." Raymond nodded in return, answering, "Go serve with honor." It was a small exchange, fleeting in time but profound in meaning, a reminder that the legacy of change was not in speeches or legislation alone, but in the individual decisions carried forward by those who had heard the message. As the crowd thinned, Raymond lingered on the steps, his eyes sweeping across the field, the blooming trees, the young men and women hugging their families. He was not thinking of the cold plastic chair in the precinct, the sting of the cuffs on his wrists, or the humiliation of being treated as a criminal. Instead, he was thinking of the path ahead, the small steps of progress that often went unnoticed but accumulated into real change. Reform, he knew, was never easy, never immediate, never without resistance. It came slowly in moments like this, in classrooms, in training sessions, in whispered shifts of culture that only revealed their strength with time. He let the breeze wash over him and allowed himself a moment of cautious hope. Maybe justice was beginning to rise on a new foundation, not one built on fear but on fairness. The weeks turned into months, and while public attention inevitably shifted to other stories, the reforms continued to take root. Departments across Michigan integrated new protocols. Oversight committees began investigating complaints with fresh rigor, and communities saw signs, however tentative, that accountability was no longer a hollow promise. Not everyone celebrated. Some officers bristled. Unions filed grievances. Critics dismissed the measures as political theater. But for those who had lived too long under suspicion and unequal treatment, the changes represented a breath of possibility. And always the image of Judge Carter remained in the background, not wielded by him but carried by others as a symbol of resilience and transformation. For Raymond, the ordeal became less a scar than a mission. He continued to serve on the bench with the same fairness, but now every ruling, every admonition, every word carried an extra resonance. He understood more keenly than ever that justice was fragile, easily undermined by assumption or arrogance, yet capable of profound strength when anchored in dignity. In speeches to law students and young attorneys, he spoke not of his own arrest but of the broader truth it revealed, urging them to see their future roles not as positions of power, but as trusts of responsibility. Years later, people would still recall the viral video, the arrest, the headlines, but those who knew him best understood that the true legacy was quieter, subtler, found in the cadets who remembered his words, the communities that gained oversight, the courts that carried his presence as a reminder of what justice demanded. He himself never claimed victory, never sought vindication, never raised his voice in bitterness. He simply continued, steady and resolute, believing that the strongest stand was often the one taken with calm, clarity, and courage. On that spring afternoon at the academy, as the sun dipped lower and families embraced their graduating cadets, Judge Raymond Carter finally descended the steps and walked away, not as a victim but as a builder of something better. He knew the journey ahead would be long, that true reform never arrived in a single sweep, but he also knew that real change began in the smallest of decisions, in the moments when no one was watching. His story was a reminder that power does not always roar. Sometimes it stands still, speaks softly, and waits patiently for the world to catch up. And in a country still wrestling with its deep divides, that quiet purpose might just be the foundation on which fairness could finally stand.